Warning: this video contains massive spoilers for the entirety of the Science Adventure series, including spin-offs and side material. Everything from Chaos Head Noah to Anonymous Code is fair game.
So the fate line could not be annulled. This only proves that Gaia synthesized this world. Our world is fundamentally digital.
Anonymous Code, the mythical game that took over 7 years to release, and the legendary SciADV installment that forever changed everything we thought we knew about the series. SciADV fans waited for what seemed like an eternity for this game, making many grow cynical and skeptical about its role in the series. Nonetheless, year after year, series creator Chiyomaru Shakura was adamant that Anonymous Code would come out and that its purpose would be to resolve SciADV's remaining mysteries. But alas, in the summer of 2022, they finally released it. And oh boy was that wait worth it, because Anonymous Code completely flipped the Science Adventure series over on its head and advanced the series' storyline more than the previous several entries did combined. With the game's context, it became abundantly clear that the events of Anonymous Code were planned right from the beginning of the series. Ultimately, Anonymous Code is conceptually, narratively, and thematically the grand culmination of everything the Science Adventure series has been building up to for almost 15 years. From the concepts of Gigalomania and the simulation twist in Chaos Head Noah, to the world line mechanics introduced in Steins, to the concepts of AI and AR explored in Robotics notes, to even the ideas of living ghosts and the meaning of life in Occultic 9. Anonymous Code is the payoff for all that build-up. It answers a myriad of questions stemming back to the release of Chaos Head, and even addresses mysteries from some of the most obscure pieces of SciADV side material. And with the ending of Anonymous Code effectively soft rebooting the series, the game has also added just as many questions as it has answered. But one thing is for sure, Anonymous Code has completely flipped our understanding of SciADV upside down. In this video, I'll break down the implications that Anonymous Code has on SciADV at large. First, I'll discuss its implications on the series overall, and then its implications on each of the SciADV sub-series, starting with Chaos Head and working my way through to beyond Anonymous Code. Just a disclaimer before getting started, this video is not completely exhaustive of every single one of Anonymous Code's implications. There's inevitably going to be something that I miss, especially with how much of the series' side material is untranslated. And as more and more content in the series releases, some of the information in this video will inevitably become outdated and potentially even falsified. But with that in mind, let's get started with the series-wide implications. The first and most obvious one is that SciADV takes place inside an Earth simulator known as Gaia. Surprise, surprise. We've known ever since Chaos Head Noah that the series took place inside a multi-layered simulation. You would have to be reading the series with your eyes closed to miss it. The center root spells it out explicitly, and it's rubbed in your face multiple times in every single entry in the series. Just a couple examples to highlight. In Chaos Head Noah, even outside of the center root, Takumi constantly questions whether someone is controlling him the same way that he is controlling Neidhart and Esso. Meanwhile, Steins literally begins with Okabe talking to whoever's on the other side of the monitor, and the Future Gadget Lab questions whether they're in a simulation the way that Alpaca Man is in one for them. After some of their first time travel experiments, they lament that for any of this to be possible, they'd have to be in a simulation or something, which they guessed correctly. Then, in a bad ending in the Occultic 9 visual novel, Gamon gets moved to this world of zeros and ones. I wonder what that can mean. References to the series taking place in a simulation are also littered throughout the lyrics of almost every single song for the series, those composed by Chiyomaru Shakura anyways. In fact, Some of the song lyrics outright foreshadow the events of Anonymous Code, such as Cosmic Blooper and Fatima. But in any case, taking place in a simulation is not a twist that's introduced by Anonymous Code, but rather what I would outright consider to be part of SciADV's very premise. We've known that the series takes place in a simulation ever since Chaos had Noah, the very first entry in SciADV, and it's always been in our faces throughout the entire series. So this is not anything new, and unless you, for whatever reason, skipped most of the series material before Anonymous Code, it shouldn't be new at all. What is somewhat new is the understanding that the Earth simulator the series takes place in is Gaia. It's not entirely new, as the mythological concept of Gaia and Gaia-related imagery shows up all throughout SciADV. In Greek mythology, Gaia is the personification of the Earth, the will of the world, or fate's design, if you please. With free will versus determinism being one of the key focuses of SciADV as a franchise, we've seen this everywhere, and especially within the Steins subseries. After all, Okabe himself repeatedly describes convergence as the will of the world all throughout the second half of the original Steins Gate. Additionally, for Chaos Head, we see signs for Gaia show up in posters for the game, and Fest's concert venue is known as Gigantes, which in Greek mythology are the children of Gaia. Another very obvious example of Gaia-related imagery is with Shido, or 4 degrees Celsius, who always rambles on and on about hearing the whispers of Gaia, being chosen by Gaia, and having access to knowledge he otherwise shouldn't have. In fact, his theme in Linear Bounded Phenagram is literally titled Whisper of Gaia, so most, including myself, believe that such would suggest that Shido, or 4 degrees Celsius, may be a debugger, or at the very least, a contactee. But the point is, Gaia itself is absolutely not a new concept to SciADV, but it being the name of the Earth simulator the series takes place in is extremely fitting, considering both the sheer amount of pre-existing Gaia-related imagery within the franchise, as well as what Gaia mythologically represents. Anyhow, the next big series-wide implication I wanted to discuss is what the series' mechanics actually are, as well as the reason for why they exist. Before Anonymous Code, most SciADV fans thought of each of the subseries' different mechanics as largely unrelated to one another, for instance, reading Steiner and Gigalomania. After all, certain moments earlier on in the series, such as the meeting between Okabe and Senna in Chaos Gate, as well as the lab raid in Steins Gate 0, pointed to such a conclusion. But we now know that they're effectively the same thing, or rather, the results of the exact same cause. As per the Anonymous Code Guidebook, A Beginner's Guide to Earth Simulator, each SciADV entry is a simulated program, hence why they all have semicolons in their titles, and the mechanics of every SciADV entry are made possible due to parameter adjustments in the simulation. So for instance, why you're able to convert memories into data in Steins Gate, as well as why electromagnetic souls and ghosts exist in Occultic 9. When I go subseries by subseries, I'll talk more about what this means for the mechanics of each individual title, because it is genuinely a game changer. Before Anonymous Code, personally, I was a bit puzzled as to how the series could reconcile the mechanics of something like Steins Gate with those of Occultic 9, with how vastly different they are from one another, and with how the latter feels a little bit more fantastical at times. With Anonymous Code, its guidebook, and all the reveals in the two, all of that's more or less been explained and resolved. One of the most mind-blowing parts about this reveal was when people realized that series-wide terminology surrounding these mechanics also made it clear that their interconnectedness was always planned right from the start of the series. When Anonymous Code released, the series' translators, both official and fan translators alike, realized that some of what they had translated in previous games was now completely wrong and not to the creators' intent. It became evident that in every single SciADV title, there was always a set of series-wide key terms all referring to the exact same concepts game after game. Load, region, interference, observer, and irregularity. and each of these key terms were always used specifically in relation to the special abilities and mechanics associated with each game. It became increasingly more evident to the fandom how damaging it was for all the games to have been officially translated by different people with varying levels of context and understanding for the wider series. But moving on to the huge elephant in the room, the next massive series implication is with regards to what the ending of Anonymous Code does for the overall series continuity. To prevent the apocalypse or the end, they needed to ensure that the year 2038 problem was solved for each and every single world layer. Betting on the topmost world layer having solved it themselves, their solution was a world line collapse or world line supershift. To do so, they would effectively do something very similar to what they do in the ISA route from Chaos at Noah, but on steroids. They would overload Gaia by having over 1 billion people simultaneously use sacraments, aka Gigalomania, and then thereby force the simulation to reboot itself. In rebooting the simulation the series takes place in, they effectively also soft reboot the series itself, virtually ending the original continuity and starting up a new one. The world line collapse sets every world layer in Gaia to parity with the topmost world layer, or reality. It's basically a simulation-wide world line shift where every world layer is synchronized and set to the same exact world line as topside, with every individual's memories and existences matching those on topside. Now, there's a variety of different reasons as to why a soft reboot could be beneficial for the series as a whole. It would give the SciADV team greater flexibility in developing future titles since they wouldn't have to worry as much about consistency. And it can also make it easier for newcomers to start with later mainlines if set in a new continuity. As it stands right now, they advertise that you can start with any SciADV game, but the reality is that if you want to truly understand and enjoy what you're playing, that really isn't true. As I'm sure this video demonstrates, SciADV entries are not separate standalone stories that just happen to be set in the same universe. They're all extremely interconnected. But with regards to what parity with topside would imply, as per the Anonymous Code guidebook, the only reason that any of the series mechanics are possible is because of the simulated nature of the series, as well as the specific parameter adjustments that allowed for more erroneous elements like Gigalomania and ghosts. The topmost world layer is reality itself, where none of the series' essential mechanics are possible, and by extension, where none of the series could possibly take place. So with all the world layers being identical with reality, what does this actually mean for the previous entries and the overall series continuity? With them barely showing the world after the world line collapse, it really begs a whole laundry list of new questions. For one, are SciADV mechanics like Gigalomania still a thing? Given that every world layer is set to parity with reality, you wouldn't expect any series mechanics to persist, since none of them can exist in reality. And unless somehow it was the topmost world layer that adjusted for all the series parameters in the first Earth simulator, and that somehow trickled down to every other world layer during the world line collapse, I just can't see how most of the series' mechanics would survive. The one complicating matter to this situation is with reading Steiner, which survives in both endings of the story, both in the normal ending, where you do not interfere and reintroduce Momo's existence back into Gaia, and the true ending, where you do. Many might consider reading Steiner's continued existence at the end of the game to potentially be evidence that Gigalomania and the other SciADV mechanics persist past the worldline collapse. But I suspect that reading Steiner's existence is not something that has to do with the parameters adjusted for speculative science, but rather a quality intrinsic to the simulation itself, devoid of those parameter alterations. Even before Steins Gate was conceived, we'd seen the general phenomenon of reading Steiner in delusional SciADV Chaos at Noah, the first entry in the series. Chaos at Noah establishes that at any point that you reboot something into the world, the universe reconstructs itself such that that rebooted object was always a thing, and everybody's memories, save for those of Gigalomaniacs, are changed such that that rebooted object was always present. This was evident in the ISA flowerbed scene, for instance. So as the likes of Takumi and Senna demonstrate there, reading Steiner as a phenomenon existed in SciADV seemingly before any sort of speculative science parameter adjustments for the observation of Steins Gate. So I believe that reading Steiner is a type of error intrinsic to the simulation itself, rather than one of the errors that's specifically allowed for by the simulation's speculative science parameter adjustments. I would instead think that the speculative science mechanics allowed for by simulation parameter adjustments would rather be demails, time leaps, physical time travel, as well as CERN's experimentation, as we know from the Steins Gate guidebook, not reading Steiner. Additionally, the worldline collapse itself is effectively a simulation-wide worldline change, and with something on that scale, I wouldn't expect the full process to be completely free of error. On his Twitcasting livestreams, Chiyomaru once commented that the further and further down you go in the world layer system, the more erroneous and lower resolution the simulation becomes. Momo also says something along the same lines within the game too, that the more world layers you have, the greater the chance of error in one of them. So seemingly, some types of errors occur in the simulation even without additional parameter adjustments for observation. And if the world layer we witness in anonymous code is far down enough, that could explain why we see reading Steiner survive, especially after the worldline collapse where the world layers begin to diverge again. But in any case, I firmly believe that the most parsimonious outcome of the worldline collapse is that all mechanics other than reading Steiner are no longer a thing. If they do survive, then the big question is, why? But of course, we're left in the dark, barely seeing a couple of minutes past the worldline collapse, which leaves us with many, many more questions. This is especially the case since the world after the worldline collapse looks identical to that of the world before then, even with sad mourning no longer happening, and the world presumably no longer being on the Steins Gate worldline, since the events we know to have occurred on the Steins Gate worldline aren't possible to have occurred anymore. For instance, one big question that a lot of people have is, do the delusional existences, Takumi and Serika, still exist? At least as of the time that the world layers synchronize, the intuitive answer would be no, since they can't exist on topside, and every world layer is now identical to reality. There's of course nothing stopping an observer from implementing parameter adjustments that would reintroduce previous SciADV mechanics into the series post-anonymous code, but even if an observer were to reintroduce the parameter modifications for delusional science, that wouldn't restore the delusional existences. Takumi and Serika would have had their data stored beyond the load region in a manner akin to that of Momo, or something to continue existing past the worldline collapse. And speaking of Takumi, is the IR2 equation that Shogun real-booted still valid? Heck, does mass energy equivalence still hold, given that Einstein was a gigalomaniac who himself real-booted that law of physics into existence? And by extension, didn't he also real-boot the very physics that makes Steins Gate's mechanics possible? Is any of that still possible? As was the case before, the most logical answer to all of these would be no. But then just how alien to what we know in the series is reality in the topmost world layer? And of course, extending past anonymous code and into the series' future, what does all this mean for Steins Gate Reboot? Could it possibly be the post-collapse continuity's version of Steins Gate's events, as many of us suspect it to be? Or is it just an unambitious cash grab remake in the original continuity? If it's the former, then I imagine that all simulation parameters would have had to have been reset to how they were before the worldline collapse anyways. But for now, we'll have to wait and see how things are with Reboot when it releases later this year. One thing I'll have to keep a watch out for is how it references the events of Chaos Head. If the events of Chaos Head happen, then of course, delusional science mechanics persist post-collapse, and we thus have answers to a lot of questions. Beyond the worldline collapse, I also wanted to talk about Anonymous Code's implications on our understanding of the concepts of world lines and world layers, as well as what that means for the series overall. From the very beginning of the franchise, these two concepts have been key to our understanding of the general world of SciADV. World lines we of course know from Steins Gate, an infinite number of possible worlds of which only one can be fully active at once. But anonymous code expands upon our understanding of world lines in a number of ways, some of which I will talk about now, and others of which I will expand upon more in the Steins Gate specific section. But anonymous code introduces another term to refer to a world line, that being a fate line, which is used by members of Holy Office 513. By and large, the two terms refer to the same thing. The fate line is just the Vatican's term for the world line, or rather, their vision of it as they observe from Necro Pilgrimage. But given that the term fate line has been used in the series before in Avant Story, from a series lore standpoint, it is pretty interesting to see its equivalence to a world line. Meanwhile, the term world layer is a concept that's explicitly named in series for the first time ever in anonymous code, but we've seen it in some form all throughout the series, starting from the very beginning with Chaos Head Noah vis-a-vis the character roots and the idea of delusions within delusions, or otherwise, worlds within worlds. To briefly recap what world layers are, if you had a simulation inside another simulation, and so on and so forth, each individual simulation within that whole hierarchical structure is what we would know as a world layer. And each world layer can potentially be on a different world line, and you can have multiple different world layers on the same world line with differing events. The introduction of the concept of world layers resolves a lot of continuity discrepancies seen previously throughout the franchise, such as with Steins Gate having somewhat contradictory and overlapping sequels, and Robotics Notes Dash having chronologically overlapping character roots, all taking place on the Steins Gate world line. With the concept of world layers, these have more or less been resolved since you can have multiple versions of the Steins Gate world line, each on different world layers. Similarly, this also resolves issues concerning the fit of Chaos I'd Love Choo Choo in the series, since it doesn't actually have a true ending. The concept of world layers thus effectively means that you can more or less consider anything and everything ever released within SciADV to be canon, for the lack of a better term. Now, we knew about the term world layers ever since the general plot for anonymous code was unveiled early in its development. But the way they ultimately went about using the concept in the final version of the story ended up differing greatly from how marketing suggested it would be earlier on in the game's development. One early diagram suggested that the first 4 main lines were all on the same world layer, while Occultic 9 and Anonymous Code were on a higher, different world layer. But in the final version of Anonymous Code, this was not exactly the case. There's really just one thing that appears to remain similar with what this diagram implies, and that's that Anonymous Code and half the versions of Occultic 9 seem to be on a higher world layer than the first 4 mainlines, just based on the terminology used. Chiyomaru in his Twitcasting livestreams talked about terminology being a key indicator of world layer placement of an individual part of the series. He specifically mentioned how in higher world layers, they would use terms more in line with those used in our reality. For instance, in higher world layers, they would use IBM instead of IBN, or Twitter instead of Tweepo. In the light novel and anime versions of Occultic 9, they use Twitter instead of Tweepo, so we can infer that they occur on a higher world layer. Meanwhile, in Anonymous Code, we see them use the term IBM 5100 instead of IBN 5100 like it's used in Steins Gate, which would suggest that Anonymous Code is on a higher world layer than the first 4 mainlines at the very least. Intriguingly, Anonymous Code does also have one instance where they use IBN instead of IBM though. Whether this was a typo or something to indicate world layer placement, I don't know. But the general terminology in Anonymous Code does point to it most likely being on a higher world layer than the exact versions of the first 4 mainlines that we went through. Speaking of which, we know that some version of each of the first 4 mainlines took place on the Steins Gate world line. But now, there is no guarantee that even the first 4 mainlines, at least the exact versions of those events that we observe, take place on the same exact world layer. In each world layer that the first 4 mainlines take place on, some version of its preceding titles took place, with them all being on the Steins Gate world line. But now, there's the question of which Steins Gate world line, given that we can have different versions of the Steins Gate world line on different world layers. So there is the possibility that the first 4 main lines take place on different world layers, but obviously all on their own equivalents of the Steins Gate world line. Such could explain the date retcon with Chaos Head. Chaos Head Noah, at least the version of it that we observe, takes place in 2008, but each of the following entries act as if it happened in 2009. If they are on different world layers, then that reconciles these continuity differences between Chaos Head Noah and the subsequent entries. But that just about wraps up the overarching series-wide implications that I wanted to discuss about world lines and world layers. So now let's move on to our last major set of series-wide implications, that being the bombshell of Chapter 11, the concepts of what's known as Beyond the Load Region, as well as the Black Knight. In Chapter 11, because Momo would disappear from the world following a worldline collapse, Polon needed to store her existence entirely outside the world layer system, somewhere that'd be completely unaffected by the worldline collapse. Upon consulting Korihisa Kent, the solution they came across was using the Black Knight to contact Anon, who's an observer not simply from a higher world layer, but rather someone outside the Gaia world layer system entirely. In real life, the Black Knight satellite is from an old conspiracy theory about an alien-run UFO secretly orbiting the planet. And in series, they sort of play about the same general concept. Anonymous Code establishes that the Black Knight satellite acts as an observer's eyes, and is outside the observable world in SciADV. Rather, it is located beyond the load region, a term Kent uses to refer to the unobserved part of the simulation where Gaia would handle all its errors. In order to reach beyond the load region devoid of an observer's interference, they would have to temporarily glitch the world through the use of a vortex coil acting as a perpetual motion machine. Now, both these concepts should immediately raise your eyebrows because we've seen them throughout the series beforehand. In the case of the Black Knight, the concept was referenced before in Variant Space Octet. And in the Chaos Head subseries, it's the exact same term that ISA uses to refer to the 7 gigalomaniacs in Shibuya. And now, with what Anonymous Code has revealed, it seems as though the entire SciADV franchise up to this point has been observed from the viewpoint of the Black Knight. Truly, from the viewpoint of a sky-clad observer. Meanwhile, the concept of what's beyond the load region, for obvious reasons, is the much more jaw-dropping reveal. It completely recontextualizes a huge number of series plot points from Chaos Head all the way to Occultic 9. With the context of what's revealed in Anonymous Code, we now know that Beyond the Load Region is effectively the same thing as the Direct C from the Chaos series, as well as the Ghost World from Occultic 9. In Chaos Head Noah, Senna talks about how the world is composed of zeros, ones, and minus ones, as well as how D-swords are shortcuts to access that -1. And Beyond the Load Region is basically that -1 of the world she was talking about, the Dirac Sea. Similarly, as I said before, the monochrome Ghost World in Occultic 9 is also Beyond the Load Region, being where the simulation stores trash data, presumably to account for the case in which they need to rewind it, which they do at the end of the anime. Beyond just the mainline entries, this concept's reveal is also a huge game changer for our understanding of a number of pieces of Steins Gate side material. Most notably, Variant Space Octet, Linear Bounded Phenogram and Linear Bounded Mosaicism, as well as Load Region of Deja Vu. The aforementioned pieces of Steins Gate side material all had plots revolving around this mysterious monochrome space. In Variant Space Octet, for instance, the ending of the story involves the world seemingly shifting to this entirely monochrome space where Okabe and Takumi meet face to face. But the most infamous of these examples is in the Steins Gate movie, Load Region of Deja Vu, in which Okabe completely disappears from the world after being flooded with memories from other world lines and getting to a point that he can no longer recognize the Steins Gate world line as his own reality. Kurisu and Susaha hypothesize that he's moved over to what they call this R world line, though as we know from its accompanying drama CD, an a posteriori existence or an a posteriori being, they recognize it's not truly a world line, but rather something more akin to a universal trash compactor. They just call where he's disappeared into the our world line because they're just completely baffled by his disappearance and don't know what else to call the place he's disappeared into. The movie's novelization delves into this further, explicitly confirming that what they refer to as the Our World line isn't a world line, but rather this monochrome space that acts as the universe's trash compactor, a place filled with inconvenient memories discarded from a convenient world line. The whole goal of the movie is for Kurisu to give Okabe a memory so strong it surpasses the strength of his reading Steiner and keeps him grounded to reality. Before Anonymous Code, we could explain the general concept for Okabe's disappearance with the context of the Senna Roots reveals. After all, if you are to believe the people typing at the terminal, then the root establishes that the series takes place in a multi-layered simulation with self-correcting mechanisms to maintain stability in the simulation. Moreover, as we observe from the baby at the root's end, it's also possible for errors to bypass the simulation's self-correcting structures if they aren't perceived as significant enough to warrant correcting. So even before Anonymous Code, we could largely understand the movie's general plot with the context of the Senna root, the movie's novelization, as well as its accompanying drama CD. But we still had some big mysteries left to us. We didn't really have a proper name for this monochrome space, nor did we completely understand the phenomenon behind Okabe's disappearance in the Steins Gate movie. But now, after Anonymous Code, and in conjunction with the pre-existing context from Chaos at Noah and the movie's supplementary materials, we much better understand what actually happens in the Steins Gate movie. In reality, what happens in the Steins Gate movie is that Okabe gets unloaded from the simulation itself and moves beyond the load region because Gaia considers his existence too erroneous after he's no longer able to recognize the Steins Gate world line as his own. Even beyond just the Steins Gate movie, the concept of what's beyond the load region can also potentially explain Suzuha's disappearance at the end of Steins Gate. This plot point is often regarded as one of the most confusing parts of the series. If you look on the SciADV subreddit, every now and then, you come across people posting about it as if it were a plot hole, because of how much goes unexplained during it. After all, Suzuha shouldn't just disappear from the world, right? Physical time travelers are effectively just walking D-mails. They arrive on a different world line than they came from, and thus exist as effects with their causes no longer being a thing. Similarly, when you send a D-mail to the past, the world reconstructs itself such that your past self receives that message, but you don't actually end up sending it yourself on that new world line. It's an effect with a cause that no longer exists. So eliminating the cause to send the D-mail, or even traveling back to the past, shouldn't cause a disappearance, right? At first glance, that would seem to contradict the rules of the series and thus be a plot hole. But with full series context, and especially the context of the Senna root and Anonymous Code, you understand that more may be at play here. What if Suzuha's disappearance from the world is just like Okabe's disappearance in the movie? That is, what if Suzuha and her time machine got sent beyond the load region because their existences were no longer supported by convergence at an attractor field level and were thus too erroneous to remain? I believe that Suzuha and her time machine getting sent beyond the load region is a very plausible explanation as to why they disappeared. But of course, if this is the case, then that begs the question of whether or not Okabe should still remember Suzuha even with his strong reading Steiner. And of course, other explanations without cross-series context can still stand. A common theory for Suzuha's disappearance is that she simply lied to Okabe and just used the time machine to travel again. After all, the description of Suzuha's disappearance, with the time machine glittering, matches exactly with that of when the time machine is just used normally. Either theory is possible, as are others. But nonetheless, Anonymous Code has further opened the floor to other explanations for Suzuha's disappearance. But that's about it from the series-wide implications that I wanted to discuss. So now I wanted to move into the sub-series specific implications, starting with the Chaos series. People tend to emphasize how Steins Gate heavy Anonymous Code is, But at a deeper level, Anonymous Code is just as heavy in Chaos Series elements as it is in Steins subseries elements. And I think it's very fitting that one of Chaoshead's earlier working titles was Code. Even before you actually start up Anonymous Code, when you read the game's guidebook, it's abundantly clear just how intertwined it is with the Chaos games. In A Beginner's Guide to Earth Simulator, Naota Takahashi makes a very fascinating author comment regarding his thematic intentions when writing Anonymous Code, tying it back to the main themes of Chaos Head. In particular, he cites exploring the SciADV franchise's series-defining quote, "Is the scenery your eyes perceive truly real?" And the most goosebump-inducing part of the entire guidebook is the way Hayashi refers to Anonymous Code as the final position of this question, as is evident by it being called a meta-science adventure. Just like Chaos Head, and pretty much every other following entry in the series, Anonymous Code is yet another exploration of a world at the boundary of what is real and what isn't, a world where what you see might not necessarily be reality. The Chaos games, and even Robotics notes, tackle this topic more from the lens of examining the state of the world in the age of the internet with all the misinformation, disinformation, and echo chambers that persist in this day and age. While still present, that all takes a bit more of a backseat in Anonymous Code. Compared to the other entries in the series, Anonymous Code boasts a far heavier and far more explicit focus on the implications of being in a simulation. That is to say, when it tackles the question, "Is the scenery your eyes perceive truly real?" it does so from the perspective of not only everything you see not being real, but also you and everyone else around you not being real. Of course, being in a simulation is one of the most basic elements of SciADV's premise, and yet it's something that the other titles tackle much more subtly. But the way Anonymous Code explicitly tackles and clarifies aspects about the simulated nature of the series recontextualizes a fair number of aspects of the Chaos games. The world, or people not being real, is a recurring idea all throughout the Chaos series. For instance, in Chaos Ed Noah, Senna constantly refers to human beings as electronic devices, and this isn't just from a standpoint of visual rebuilding technology. There's an obvious double meaning to that surrounding them all being digital existences. The first chapter of Chaos Child, being titled Digital Native, has another double meaning in the same regard as well. It's both a reference to the generation that grew up with the internet, as well as the fact that they're in a simulation. More than that, there's the character roots, which in hindsight are an obvious reference to the concept of world layers. In Chaos Ed Noah, the character roots are simulated worlds that Shogun shows to Takumi before the former's death in order to get the latter to live. In Chaos Head Love Choo Choo, as well as both Chaos Child games meanwhile, the character roots are the results of delusion synchros. In essence, they are worlds within shared delusions, or otherwise, worlds within worlds. The Uki root in Chaos Child takes things a step further, being a delusion within a delusion, which itself is within another delusion from a reality that's effectively in a multi-layered simulation. And for Chaos Child, the entire game, outside of Silent Sky, the true ending, takes place within a delusion, an intentional allegory to the idea of echo chambers in a digital age, but also something very intricately representative of the actual structure of the series' world. Beyond that, on a more individual level, Anonymous Code has somewhat recontextualized everything surrounding being a delusional existence. In Chaos Ed Noah, Takumi, in more ways than one, finds out that he's not actually a real person. He's Shogun's real-booted delusion whose primary purpose was to awaken as a gigalomaniac and stop Norose from using Noah to create his delusion-wrought utopia. And as he finds out in the center route, it seems he's also in a simulation, just as he suspected all along. Whose eyes are those eyes? Those eyes are God's eyes. Not simply Shogun's eyes, but those of an observer on a higher layer of existence. Ultimately, Takumi's character arc is about coming to accept that even as a delusional existence, even as someone living inside a simulation, his life isn't meaningless. No one's existence is meaningless. Not a few decide it isn't. Anonymous code heavily ties into this idea, but this time on a global scale. And because of its context, I personally feel as though the character arcs of both Takumi and even Serika hit several times harder now. After all, even as delusional existences, they're just as legitimate as everybody else in their world. And in the last few chapters of Anonymous Code, where the whole world finds out that they're in a simulation and that they'll soon cease to exist due to the apocalypse, countless fall into despair and try to take their own lives like Takumi did in Chaos Head. For a while, this despair extends over to even some of the main cast members, Oz particularly, since living through his near-death experience in space was nothing short of a miracle. After going through all that, the gut-wrenching truth behind his existence shattered his soul. But even when tackling SciADV's series-defining question in its so-called final position, Anonymous Code has the same exact answer the series always has. It's incredibly adamant about how anybody's life is worth living no matter what, even if your whole world is falling apart, even if everything you've ever believed in is proven wrong. You keep fighting no matter what. Now, on a different and more story-focused note, Anonymous Code also makes us understand Norase's goals and Noah 2 a fair bit differently as well. From what's established in Chaos Head Noah alone, Norase wanted to create a utopian world through Noah 2, a perpetual motion machine which was effectively like an artificial gigalomaniac capable of not only projecting delusions onto the rest of the world, but also real-booting them into reality thanks to the IR2 equation. In order to become powerful enough to create a worldwide delusion-wrought utopia, it needed enough gigalomaniac code samples, hence why Nozomi went after all the main cast members. But with the context of Anonymous Code, we now understand that Noah 2 itself is actually an Earth simulator, and that Norase succeeding at his goals would likely have led to a worldline collapse. To start off with explaining the first point, in Anonymous Code, Necropilgrimage, the Vatican's Earth simulator, is used almost identically to the way that Nozomi uses Noah 2. After all, through Necropilgrimage, Holy Office 513 is able to grant individuals the power of sacraments, special abilities with the power to cause interference with the simulation. The Necropilgrimage-derived sacrament wielders in Anonymous Code are thus akin to the Noah 2-derived porters in Chaos Head Noah. In Chapter 10, when Momo connects 1 billion people to Necropilgrimage to give them the power of sacraments, someone on 4chan comments, "It's just a gigalomaniac, dahaha," who we can assume to be Rimi based off the style of speech. This comment alone should immediately make the connection between Necropilgrimage and Noah 2 obvious. But instead of using code samples of gigalomaniacs, Holy Office 513 uses artificial brains implanted with the DNA data of contactees from the Necropilgrimage world layer below. They believed that contactees had some kind of special qualities or factors in their brains which would allow them to perform the miraculous. As a part of this, they attempted to incarnate the children of Fatima through the use of Necropilgrimage, very similarly to the way that Noah 2 would real-boot something. The only successful incarnation was that of Lucia or Momo, but in incarnating her, they inadvertently caused sad mourning due to it being an act of excessive simulation interference. So clearly, the way that Necropilgrimage is used is very obviously identical to the way that Noah 2 is used. But the reverse is also true. The way that Norase uses Noah 2 in Chaos Head Noah is also very much akin to the way that the various factions throughout Anonymous Code use their own Earth simulators. There's one particular scene in Chaos Head Noah during which Norase betrays Kuramochi and Inohana from the in-layer Committee of 300, where he states that their ultimate demise was not simply just a foolish part of his plans, but rather foreknowledge, something he was foretold would happen. With the context of Anonymous Code, we now understand that based on this scene, Norase very likely used Noah 2 as an Earth simulator. Just as gigalomaniacs like Shogun can create their own simulated worlds, so can an artificial gigalomaniac like Noah 2, especially when empowered by multiple gigalomaniac code samples. Now, to explain the second point I brought up earlier, many hypothesize that Noah 2's successful completion and implementation would likely have led to a worldline collapse because it would be inducing a humongous load on the entirety of Chaos Ed's world layer by completely transforming the world itself. In essence, global-scale delusions for all humans wrought by Noah 2 should very likely cause the Gaia QCDC itself to reboot and thus bring about a worldline collapse. Such would explain why in the Senna route, Momose and the Committee of 300 on the world layer above were desperate to have Norose's plan stopped at all costs. If Norose won, then the simulation would literally reboot. However, this does beg the question of what happens in the Crying Sky route where Norose does win and successfully extracts Takumi's code sample. While it is in a simulated world brought about by Shogun's delusion, if Norose's victory would have caused a worldline collapse, then we should see the worldline collapse in the Crying Sky end. Yet we don't. There's still ways you could possibly explain the discrepancy. Maybe it being a world in a delusion doesn't subject it to the same conditions as a proper world layer. Or perhaps maybe the route just ends before we can see Norose properly implement his goals on a global scale. After all, we end off the route seeing the world in ruins and with Rimi killing Takumi. So I do still believe that Noah 2 attempting to implement a global utopia would have just rebooted the simulation. Two more Chaos Series plot points that Anonymous Code somewhat recontextualizes are Shogun's illness and Chaos Child Syndrome. Anonymous Code establishes that any kind of interference increases the world's entropy, for instance through the use of sacraments. And Holy Office 513 has this physical toll payment system in place for their sacraments to account for the entropy impacts for their use. With this context, it becomes a little bit more interesting to look at the physical deterioration of Gigalomaniacs and Chaos Child Syndrome patients. The Chaos series establishes that with excessive use of Gigalomania, or when you reboot something significant like a law of physics or an entire human being, there is a physical toll you pay. This is the reason why Shogun and Takuru enter comas, and also why Shogun's physical state significantly deteriorates. And under delusion synchros, the physical states of all the Chaos Child Syndrome patients also deteriorates as well. But for all of these, the reason as to why Gigalomaniacs face these consequences in the first place has always been a bit of a mystery. With the context of Anonymous Code, we now understand the physical tolls that Gigalomaniacs pay are a consequence of their actions increasing the world's entropy. With sacrament users effectively being akin to Noah 2 porters as opposed to actual Gigalomaniacs, under normal circumstances, they would not be subject to the same toll conditions as them. But after Momo's incarnation caused sad mourning through it increasing the world's entropy, 513 opted to use IC chips instead of artificial brains for sacraments, through which they implemented a toll system to minimize their entropy impacts. Now, the last couple of things that I wanted to discuss with regards to the implications that Anonymous Code has on the Chaos series is with our understanding of the SciADV franchise's two most important character routes, those of Senna and ISA. Let's start off with the Senna route, the route whose very point is doubt itself. After all, Senna asked the question herself, is the scenery your eyes perceive truly real? If our answer is yes, and we fully believe the people writing on the terminal in the Senna route, then that would imply four particular conclusions about the SciADV world. 1. The series is in a multi-layered simulation. 2. The simulation has self-regulating measures like debuggers, who are implied to be Momose, Shido, Gen, and Shun throughout the overarching series. 3. It's possible for errors to be small enough to bypass the simulation's self-regulating mechanisms like the coin locker baby at the route's end. And 4. The Committee of 300 that we see in layer isn't actually real. Rather, what we see in series is just a bunch of different factions, each believing themselves to be the Committee of 300. In the Science Adventure series Maniac's Guidebook, the series creators confirmed that you could fully interpret the events of the Senna route as a lie cooked up by Momose, and that it was entirely possible to explain everything if that was the case. And with the context of Anonymous Code, that possibility is still perfectly valid. But everything that's stated by whoever's communicating through the terminal gets explicitly confirmed in Anonymous Code, so at the very least, most are inclined to believe a literal interpretation of the events of the Senna route now. The route with more interesting bits of recontextualization is the ISA route, especially since the plot of Anonymous Code is pretty much just what they do in the ISA route, but at a much bigger scale. In the ISA route, they use 7D swords to overload and reboot Noah 2 through excessive interference. Meanwhile, in Anonymous Code, the endgame is all about having 1 billion people use sacraments simultaneously to put enough load on the world to reboot Gaia. Funnily enough, we also now know that the apocalypse, or end, that ISA was constantly babbling about in her songs and in her prophecies was the apocalypse or end we see in Anonymous Code. But in addition to that, we also understand that the reason that ISA sees the world so differently, the reason she uniquely has access to the Gladiol saga, and the reason she has such prophetic powers is because an observer from a higher layer of existence, possibly Anon, was hacking her vision and granting her those prophetic powers. As they put it, it's the work of the greater will. It's a nice parallel to the Senna route, where you have a mechanical god from a higher layer of existence interfering with the world. In the ISA route, it's this spiritual higher power. But that more or less wraps up what I wanted to go over with respect to Anonymous Code's implications on our understanding of the Chaos series. So now, let's move on to the Steins Gate subseries' implications. When Mages first announced Anonymous Code, they announced it alongside Steins Gate 0, and promotional material for both games seemed to interconnect the two. On top of Mages making trailers featuring them both, one key visual for Steins Gate 0 has a crashed SA4D in Akihabara, which we later see in story when Okabe wakes up in 2036. By the time Anonymous Code ultimately released, it was no surprise that it was an incredibly Steins Gate heavy game. And it wasn't just the case that Steins Gate helped us better understand Anonymous Code, but rather also the reverse in so many different ways. With the context of Anonymous Code, we now understand why you can convert memories into data and send that data through a black hole, why convergence is a thing, why reading Steiner exists as a phenomenon, as well as why digital existences like Amadeus Kurisu have reading Steiner. The answer to all of those has to do with the simulated nature of the series and the parameter modifications that would further support their ability to persist. The bit about being able to convert memories into data was strongly hinted at before in the Steins Gate guidebook, where they suggested that the reason CERN was able to send massless data through micro black holes was because the world operates at a near-digital scale. Now we know very explicitly that this was always in reference to SciADV being in a simulation in which everything is data. Convergence, meanwhile, makes much more sense in that it's not simply just the will of the world, but rather what's literally been programmed into the simulation from the layer above, the destiny of the fate line, if you will. In the case of Amadeus Kurisu's reading Steiner in Twin Automata, Gaia recognizes Kurisu and Amadeus Kurisu as one and the same because everyone's digital anyways. To Gaia, they're both effectively the same person with identical data, so now this scene from Steins Gate 0 makes much more sense. Beyond this, Anonymous Code has also recontextualized a few other plot points. Even before Anonymous Code's release, Chiyomaru talked about how Alpaca Man was foreshadowing for Anonymous Code. After its release, we further understand this scene as not simply just a callback to the Sennaru twist from Chaos and Noah, but also representative of the concept of world layers. Additionally, with regards to other pieces of foreshadowing, various Anonymous Code plot points were heavily foreshadowed in Steins Gate's Rainet Kakeru episodes. For instance, the high hack plot from Anonymous Code was actually in Rainet Kakeru episode 7. So very clearly, if the Senna and ISA routes weren't enough to make it clear, they had the general ideas for Anonymous Code thought out from the very beginning of SciADV's run, and they very clearly knew what they were doing. But now, onto some of the more lore important Steins Gate related implications. One thing that Anonymous Code very explicitly establishes is that you do not need time travel to change the world line. Of course, we more or less know this implicitly from the original Steins Gate alone. After all, how else would using the IBN 5100 to delete the first email from Echelon's database take them to the beta attractor field in Steins Gate? There was no time travel involved there. Moreover, a big part of the whole plot of Variant Space Octet is Gigalomania going overboard and changing the world line at an attractor field level. So we've known that you can change the world line without time travel for a long time now. But the mechanism behind all this was left largely unexplained, until now. From anonymous code, we understand that any form of simulation interference is capable of changing the world line even at the level of an attractor field. In anonymous code, we see these forms of interference constantly, from Momo's incarnation and sad mourning, to Polon's constant saving and loading, to Holy Office 513's sacraments. And the use of excessive interference to change the world line across the entirety of Gaia is ultimately what they take advantage of to induce a world line collapse at the end of the story. Moreover, it is because of the constant interference we see throughout anonymous code that the world is in a state of world line superposition between the Steins Gate world line and the Fibonacci or Milky Way crossing world line. The whole concept of world line superposition is something we've seen all throughout SciADV, but has largely remained one of its single biggest mysteries. The first time we ever saw this concept was in Annularly Chained Ouroboros, and not too long afterwards, we saw it in its prequel, My Undarling's Embrace. In Undarling, the phone wave discharges before the lab members can complete Luca's D-mail to his mother's pager, and we then see the world enter a state of superposition between the gamma and delta attractor fields at world lines 2.615074 and 3.406288 respectively. A plot point in My Undarling's Embrace introduces this concept of the ghosting effect, in which Okabe sees multiple different versions of himself wandering around. This concept, of course, returns in linear bounded phenogram in the Suzuha route, where the provided explanation is also that the world is in a state of quantum superposition between three different world lines, presumably from the alpha, beta, and omega attractor fields. And before anonymous code, the last time we saw this concept of world line superposition was in Robotics Notes Dash. Kimijima's actions, in conjunction with the prior forms of interference seen in the two Chaos Child games, as well as the original Robotics Notes, led to what Okabe described as the world line wavering. Until Kimijima is put into a death loop, the world is in a state of world line superposition between the Steins Gate world line and the Milky Way crossing world line, just like we end up seeing in anonymous code. And when Kimijima is defeated, they presumably end up back on the Steins Gate world line as normal. So evidently, this concept of world line superposition is nothing new at all, but what is new is what anonymous code implies about the reason behind the concept's existence. The general theory behind world line superposition is that it's something you see whenever there's too much conflicting interference that threatens the stability of a given world line. As mentioned before, we see this through Polon's constant saving and loading, as well as through all the sacraments. And when Polon loads too far back or messes up, we see that it causes interference so great that his existence can't handle it, and he ends up going comatose. After awakening from his coma, we get ourselves World War III starting, signifying a move over to the Fibonacci world line. Even after anonymous code, we still have some questions about the way the whole concept of world line superposition works, but we definitely understand the phenomenon much better now than we did beforehand. Another huge lore implication anonymous code has on the Steins Gate subseries is with regards to the way the divergence meter works. In anonymous code, they introduced the M2037 model divergence meter. And from Chiyomaru's interviews around the time of anonymous code's release, he stated that the divergence meter's values were sent in the past through a mechanism akin to D-mail. Moreover, he also stated that its values were derived by comparing the similarity between present-day Earth and the data of the Earth simulator. Such would imply that this is either a comparison between the current world layer and an adjacent world layer, or a comparison between the current world layer and the topmost world layer. A comparison between the current world layer and an adjacent one is much easier to picture and would make sense with regards to ease of measurement, though the actual basis for the numerical values themselves then become a little confusing. But if it's the topmost world layer he's talking about, then intuitively, you'd think that this would imply that reality's world line is the baseline for divergence's measurements, and thus reality's world line should in theory be represented by 0.00000000 to an infinite number of digits as 0. But this begs a lot of questions. Now, we know that in every observed world line in the alpha attractor field, the time-traveling Suzuha originally comes from world line 0.000000. In this world line, we have a dystopia run by CERN and the Committee of 300, and based on the way the world looks after the world line collapse, you intuitively wouldn't think that this new resultant reality is now in a dystopia. It looks largely the same as the world before the collapse. We don't see any semblance of a dystopia. And in the first place, a CERN or Committee of 300 led dystopia couldn't happen the same way that we know because time machines can't exist in the topmost world layer. And with all the world layers synchronized with reality, there's not going to be any time machines post-collapse either. But of course, you can have a world line divergence go well past those 6 digits you see on a Nixie tube meter, so maybe there's some significant variation past that point, which makes Alpha Suzuha's original world line and reality's world line totally different from one another. For all we know, maybe 0.00000 to an infinite number of digits is akin to the Steins Gate world line in that it's like a world line between the Omega and Alpha attractor fields. But yeah, this whole system does beg a lot more questions, and seeing more of the world post-collapse should hopefully answer some of them. Nonetheless, if this is the way that the Nixie tube model of the divergence meter works, then we might have ourselves a bit of a series retcon. In the Science Adventure series Maniac's Guidebook, they established that the divergence meter gets its data through a gravitational measurement apparatus. This of course would tie into everything surrounding the GE rate in the Chaos series, and how that itself is a result of the simulated nature of the world. But now we have 2 different explanations for how the divergence meter works. Is it a retcon, or do the 2 meters perhaps just function differently? The way I, and I think most other people parse it, is that the new explanation is specifically tied to the M2037 model divergence meter, while the Maniac's Guidebook explanation is for the Nixie tube meter. That way, there's no contradiction. However, you then wonder why you get identical divergence values with 2 different systems of measurement. Maybe part of the M2037 divergence meter's measurement of the disparity between present-day Earth and the Earth simulator data takes into account differences in the gravitational error rate, thus explaining why they have identical numbers. But on note of the new M2037 model divergence meter, it shows divergence values to almost 30 decimal places, meaning we now know the lengthier divergence numbers for most of the main world lines that we have observed before. Moreover, it doesn't just show the currently active world line divergence value or values, but also a whole selection of different world lines split across 4 different groupings: F1, F2, F3, and F4. The general consensus surrounding the M2037 meter is that these are all world lines that have previously been active at some point. After all, the vast majority of these world lines are ones we literally go through during the story of Steins Gate. And in a world layer where the events of Steins Gate happen, all these world lines that we go through during the story of Steins Gate must be active at some point within that world layer as well. So the natural and most logical conclusion is that these are all previously active world lines for the world layer anonymous code takes place in. Intriguingly, the divergence meter also shows world lines we've seen before from both the Steins Gate Zero visual novel and the Steins Gate Zero anime. In particular, 1.097302 is unique to the anime, while 1.143688 is from the visual novel's Gehenna Stigma route. This all ties in with the idea of world line recursion from all the beta attractor field side material we've seen, whereby Milky Way crossing Okabe accumulated the memories of countless prior iterations as is outlined in Annularly Chained Ouroboros. However, this meter cannot possibly be exhaustive as we're missing a number of different important world lines from Steins Gate Zero, which we know for sure would happen somewhere along the chain. Moreover, it would go against the very idea of the ending of Ouroboros and Steins Gate Zero, which is that it took the efforts of countless different world line iterations for Operation Skuld to be possible. So what we see from this meter is most definitely not exhaustive. The fact that we don't see 0.000000, the world line that Alpha Suzuha time travels from, is further evidence of this not being exhaustive if it is a list of previously active world lines. And it's very possible that there's other F groupings besides the 4 that we see, or perhaps the F groups that we see are scrollable lists we just haven't seen the entirety of. In addition to the world lines from Steins Gate and Steins Gate 0, we also see 2 world lines from Linear Bounded Phenogram, as well as one from the jacket cover of Hide of the Dark Dimension. With regards to the Phenogram world lines, 0.337337 is from the Suzuha route, where we see the ghosting effect due to having 3 different world lines in quantum superposition. Meanwhile, 0.456923 is from Phenogram's Luca route, and 1.818520 is one we don't ever actually observe at any point in the series. So it would seemingly be a world line that was once active but never observed by us, which is pretty interesting. We know that Okabe once experienced reading Steiner around the time of Y2K, when he was very ill. Maybe this was that world line? Who knows? Beyond the divergence meter, Anonymous Code also sheds further light into other aspects of Steins Gate's mechanics, like the Time Leap Machine. It should be extremely obvious to anybody that Steins Gate's Time Leap Machine and Anonymous Code's save and load system are very similar. You can effectively consider the save and load mechanic to be akin to that of a time leap machine embedded into Polon's BMI, but with a couple of key differences centered around interference. Through the time leap machine, you send your current memories back to your past self through physics within the world layer, but in Anonymous Code with the save and load system, you presumably do so by hacking into the world itself, thereby interfering with the world layer at a meta level. When Polon uses Anon saves, he's free of any negative interference-related impacts as they're made at a higher layer of existence. But when Polon uses his own saves, he's subject to very similar limitations that someone who uses a time leap machine is. The Steins Gate subseries establishes 2 central limitations behind the time leap machine, a technological limit and a mental limit. The technological limit has to do with the way the time leap machine is constructed. In the original Steins Gate, Kurisu's time leap machine is only able to leap back to a maximum of 48 hours for reasons that Kurisu does not fully know. But based on the way she blames not completely understanding the insides of the machine, we can assume that these are because of technological limitations surrounding the way it's built. That's why in a number of pieces of Steins Gate side material, they are able to improve the time leap machine to be able to go back further. For instance, in Low Region of Deja Vu, Kurisu is able to use the time leap machine to go back 10 days. And in Steins Gate 0, Maho in the year 2025 improves the time leap machine so that it's able to leap back 2 weeks instead of 2 days. So the general 48-hour limit of the time leap machine in the original Steins Gate is largely a matter of technology. But there is additionally a mental limit as well. Say the technological constraints of the time leap machine were non-existent. Steins Gate establishes that even under such circumstances, you couldn't just time leap back to any point that you had a cell phone or a receiver. Past a certain point back in the past, the gap between your current memories and your younger brain would grow too big, leading to a very erroneous result that could have serious consequences. But at least within the Steins Gate subseries, we never really see what would happen if you were to try to time leap too far back into the past. But in Anonymous Code, we actually see that scenario. While the save and load system is not subject to the technological limitations we've observed in the previous time leap machines, when Polon is working with his own saves created in layer, he's still subject to the same exact mental limitations surrounding brain similarity. As I mentioned earlier, when Polon loads too far back in the past, he repeatedly ends up going comatose, and that's because his current brain and his past brain are too dissimilar, making the act of loading too great a form of interference and making the result too erroneous. You can only load so far back, or otherwise, your very existence just can't handle it. Beyond everything surrounding the time leap machine, Anonymous Code has also changed our understanding of the Phenogram viewer from linear bounded Phenogram and linear bounded mosaicism. The Phenogram viewer itself is a device through which an observer can view a number of stories on different world lines, almost like its own Earth simulator in a way. The ending of linear bounded mosaicism states that these are stories that must be forgotten if you are to leave the monochrome space, which we of course now know to be beyond the load region after Anonymous Code. In conjunction with the other monochrome imagery we see within linear bounded Phenogram, we can more or less conclude that the Phenogram viewer is located beyond the load region. Additionally, as mentioned before, it's also heavily implied that since we see some Phenogram world lines on the M2037 divergence meter, that they were also active world lines at some point in the Anonymous Code world layer's history. Moreover, some of the other phonogram world lines may just take place on different world layers, thus explaining differences in continuity and mechanics. Whatever the case may be, the concept of world layers ensures that everything officially released in SciADV can be considered canon. Now, there's just two more Steins Gate subseries specific implications that I have left to discuss. First is with respect to the term Kikan, or organization. There's very obviously a parallel between the Gaia organization and the organization that Okabe keeps Chuni rambling about. And now, a big part of the irony behind his remarks about how certain things must be the work of the organization is the very existence of the Gaia organization that runs the Gaia QCDC and Gaia. The fact that the Gaia organization also happens to have 300 employees is an extra testament to this. In hindsight, it also makes us realize that Okabe's remarks about the organization and Shido's remarks about Gaia are meant to parallel one another. Okabe is talking about who runs the Earth simulator, and Shido is talking about the Earth simulator itself. And the last implication I wanted to discuss has to do with the year 2038. Anonymous code establishes that with the apocalypse happening in 2038, all world layers are supposed to cease to exist then. Therefore, no layer's history is supposed to get past that point, except for the topmost world layer. But in linear-bounded mosaicism, we see past the year 2038. What does this mean? Even in Anonymous code, when Asuma is running Gaia, he comments that he sees past the year 2038 without any problem at all. And so, even he's confused by the circumstances surrounding the apocalypse. I just can't imagine that these two phenomena are unrelated. But alas, we wait for more related series content whenever that may come. So let's move on to the Robotics Note subseries. Taking place in 2019 and 2020, the Robotics Note subseries is the one that's chronologically closest to Anonymous code, and the technology we see permeated throughout Anonymous code is largely a direct evolution of what we see in Robotics Notes. The Pokecom-derived AR technology has now evolved to become part of everyone's brain-machine interface. Indeed, more than ever before, you truly ask yourself, is the scenery your eyes perceive truly real? Outside of just generally being interesting to see the evolution of the same technology, Anonymous code also recontextualizes a number of plot points from the Robotics Notes subseries. From the original Robotics Notes, one of the most obvious examples is how and why Irie and Sister Centipede were able to exchange memories in Phase 12. We now know that Gaia ultimately recognizes the data of Irie and Sister Centipede as one and the same. Even the so-called real human being there is also ultimately just data. Both of them are fundamentally digital existences, who are almost identical to one another. It's no surprise that just like Gaia considers Kurisu and Amadeus Kurisu identical, Irie and Sister Centipede are regarded as the same too, hence why they can interchange memory data with one another. In addition to that, we more or less have a bit more of a proper plausible explanation as to the origin of the monopoles in phases 4 and 5. They just randomly drop out of the sky with no real explanation to them whatsoever, serving largely as a deus ex machina for the rest of the story. With the context of Anonymous code, we understand now that the monopoles were most likely placed there by Anon or some other observer on a higher layer of existence who was interfering with the simulation. Thirdly, the phase transitions in Robotics Notes Elite seem to be representative of the concept of world layers. As for whether they're just for show, or if they mean that the exact versions of each phase that we observe take place on different world layers, that remains unclear. If each phase is on a different world layer, then an identical and equivalent set of events takes place in every phase's world layer's continuity. Robotics Notes Elite is functionally just a linear story after all. Given that the original Robotics Notes did not have these phase transitions, some may think that this is unlikely, and all the phases as we observe them are all on the same world layer. Moving on from the original Robotics Notes to Robotics Notes Dash, there's a couple more Anonymous code-related implications. For one, the scene at the beginning of Dash's opening, Avant Story, has been completely recontextualized. It starts off with what looks like a supercomputer booting up with the text Robotics Notes Dash now loading. We now understand from both Anonymous Code and its guidebook that every SciADV entry is a simulated program, and the scene at the start of Avant's story shows Dash's program booting up. And we see this happening one subcomponent of the supercomputer at a time until all the different parts of the supercomputer glow up with the same text saying Robotics Notes Dash now loading. This appears to be in reference to the idea of world layers and how the different chronologically overlapping character routes in the game just take place on different world layers. Whatever the case may be, the beginning of Dash's opening is very obviously a reference to the simulated nature of the series. But more than that, it also seems to be foreshadowing Anonymous Code's post-credit scene with the Vortex Coil. After all, they look to be in the exact same place with all those computers around. Considering that several versions of Anonymous Code's story had been written up by the time of Robotics Notes Dash's release, this piece of foreshadowing makes sense. After all, the lyrics of the songs in the Steins Gate Zero anime and even Steins Gate Elite all foreshadow Anonymous Code as well, and they released even before Robotics Notes Dash did. Besides everything to do with Avant's story, another one of these implications is something that I had briefly alluded to earlier, the world line wavering between the Steins Gate and Fibonacci world lines. After Anonymous Code, we further understand why the world is in a state of world line superposition, and it's simply because of how significant the combination of all the interference from the original Robotics Notes and Chaos Child were, as well as the constant interference we see throughout Dashes. With Kimijima threatening to reach singularity, he not only puts the Steins Gate world line at risk, but from what it seems, he could also potentially induce a world line collapse if successful. That about concludes the plot-related implications that Anonymous Code has in Robotics Notes. But there's two massive thematic connections between the two entries that I absolutely have to talk about before we move on to talking about Occultic 9. Robotics Notes is a story about turning one's dreams into reality, very akin to how the Chaos games have the element of turning delusions into reality. Robotics Notes is a game largely about doing the unthinkable against all possible odds, against the expectations placed on you by society, against your own personal self-doubts, and against all common sense. It's a story about chasing that impossible-seeming dream because it's your creed to do so. Anonymous Code's central line, "Make the impossible possible," is thus a callback to all its predecessor SciADV titles, but especially Robotics Notes. Relatedly, their second major thematic connection has to do with how one of the main contentions SciADV explores is that of free will versus determinism. That much is abundantly clear in every SciADV game, and Robotics Notes is no exception. If the general sense of obstinance throughout the story wasn't enough for you, the subtitle for Robotics Notes even ends off with a segment of the poem Invictus by William Ernest Henley. "I am the master of my fate, I am the captain of my soul." My single favorite scene in Anonymous Code, really my favorite scene in all of SciADV, is a callback to the subtitle, tying the themes of the entire SciADV franchise together so beautifully. That's right, I'm talking about the conversation between Kaoru and Oz towards the end of the game. Oz, so distraught over learning that he's in a simulation, begins to believe that his entire existence is completely meaningless and that his life simply isn't worth living anymore because he's a digital existence made up by someone else. Kaoru retorts this by arguing that even if the whole world is meaningless anyway, there's just as much meaning in trying to save it and fight for survival as there is in giving up entirely. If you can save your world, save your existence, then you can prove that you're the master of your fate and the captain of your soul. You only truly cease to exist when you choose to believe in nihilism, when you choose to believe that all things are meaningless and that the only thing in which all people are equal in is death. So long as you find a will and stand to fight fate, you can truly make what seems to be impossible, possible. In hindsight, this scene recontextualizes how well Robotics Notes' subtitle fits in with not only Robotics Notes and Kaito's general character arc, but also the entire SciADV franchise at large. If there's one subseries' subtitle that truly embodies the SciADV spirit, it's that of Robotics Notes. With that in mind, let's move on to Occultic 9. Before Anonymous Code had released, the placement of Occultic 9 within the SciADV canon had always been rather nebulous for a number of years. After all, it was originally planned on being a separate series from SciADV entirely, with Occultic 9 and Anonymous Code planned to be part of the science visual novel series, which was supposed to be distinct from the science adventure series. Occultic 9 was also a bit of an oddball in that it started off as a light novel rather than a visual novel, and within the light novel version of the story, Steins Gate was a fictional series. With Occultic 9 eventually having 4 different storylines in 4 different mediums, people were very confused about the way that it fit into everything, especially after Mages and Chiyomaru Studio retconned and incorporated it into SciADV. Now, after Anonymous Code, we more or less understand how Occultic 9 fits in with the SciADV canon. We can simultaneously consider all 4 versions of the story to be canon, but on different world layers. In conjunction with Chiyomaru's comments on key term usage denoting world layer placement, we also understand that certain versions of Occultic 9 take place on higher world layers than others. For instance, the light novel version of Occultic 9 uses real-life terms like Twitter and 2channel, whereas the visual novel version of the story uses the terms tweepo and @channel, indicating that the light novel version of the story takes place on a higher world layer. Such is also consistent with how in the light novel version of the story, Shun acts as if Steins Gate is a fictional series, while in the visual novel version, such commentary does not exist. As for whether world layers alone explain Steins Gate being a fictional series within some versions of Occultic 9, I don't know. But as the manga version of the story reveals, Shun is an agent for the Committee of 300 and most likely a debugger. And his debugger-related knowledge may also potentially explain his knowledge of Steins Gate. After all, there's some interesting parallels between the commentary of Shun and Gen, the latter of whom is very heavily implied to be a debugger in the Wrongsider memoirs through his knowledge of Hatano, Suzuha, and Kimijima. Beyond clarifying its placement within the series, Anonymous Code does also recontextualize a number of aspects to Occultic 9's story as well. For one, Nishizono Ririka has always been one of Occultic 9's single biggest mysteries, and during the wait for Anonymous Code, one of the fandom's single biggest focuses in theory crafting was the potential connection between Nishizono Ririka and Saionji Juno. After all, their surnames, Nishizono and Saionji, are made up of the same kanji characters. Ririka is also a ghost, while Juno has the nickname Phantom. Additionally, both Ririka and Juno are always seen with umbrellas, with the latter also being given the nickname Umbrella Girl. So given that they were both Umbrella Girls and also ghosts or phantoms, and that they shared kanji characters in their names, many were expecting that there would be some sort of twist whereby Juno would be revealed to actually be Ririka. After all, in one of the Occultic 9 visual novel's bad endings, Ririka is even able to hack into and interfere with this world of zeros and ones. But in the final version of Anonymous Code, there was nothing explicitly confirming any connection between the two. It seems that they are indeed 2 separate individuals entirely. Juno's character is modeled after the Roman goddess Juno, who is extremely jealous and deeply in love with her brother. But given the number of times they rewrote Anonymous Code, I wouldn't be surprised if the writing team planned on them being the same character in an earlier iteration of the story. One interesting thing of note on that topic is further clarification on Ririka's abilities. In Occultic 9, Ririka is seemingly able to just teleport with no real explanation as to how. In Anonymous Code, however, Juno has identical abilities with a proper explanation to the mechanics behind them. Namely, Juno is able to use quantum teleportation through quantum communication with a satellite. Based on this context, we can now infer how Ririka's teleportation abilities work. Besides everything going on with Ririka and Juno, there's another significant connection with respect to the significance of the year 2026. In Occultic 9 Volume 1, this is the year Miyu foresees in her vision of the troll who calls her while watching her livestream. And in Anonymous Code, 2026 is the year a number of different important events occur around the same time. The SA-4D satellites get announced, the Sagrada Familia gets completed, and the Anti-Fate factions battle takes place. With regards to the significance of the SA-4D announcement date, in the opening of the Occultic 9 anime, the Holy 3 Squared, they also outright show Sad Morning, which is when the SA-4D satellites outright misfired. And in addition to everything surrounding the events taking place in the Vatican, Chiyomaru has stated that if a SciADV crossover were to happen, it would most likely take place in 2026. So evidently, there's been a number of hints as to the significance of the year 2026. and moving forward, I fully expect a future title to take place in 2026, be it Steins something or something else. This much is just my own personal speculation, but I also believe that 2026 might just be the year that Gamon awakes from cold sleep. But of course, we won't know for sure until Chiyomaru finishes Occultic 9, and who knows when that will be. Finally, the last major Occultic 9 related implication I wanted to talk about was Nikola Tesla. Being Aveline's father, as well as the man behind the key to the universe and the world wireless system, Nikola Tesla is one of the most central figures in Occultic 9, and he's mentioned extensively throughout Anonymous Code, but in ways that make us understand him a bit differently from the way he's depicted in Occultic 9. Anonymous Code reveals that Tesla was a contactee who made several attempts to reach the Black Knight, but failed because he was not being observed by an observer in real time. Had he succeeded, he likely would have survived much longer than he actually did. We also now understand that his frequency-related experiments were specifically to help him access beyond the Lode region, where he would both see ghosts as well as the Black Knight. And with the context of Anonymous Code, we understand that the reason that ghosts exist beyond the Lode region is likely because the simulation needs to store data of deceased souls somewhere in the event that they need to rewind the simulation or rewind time, as they do at the end of the anime. But that just about wraps up the implications not only of Occultic 9, but also each individual SciADV subseries that's released so far. So now let's move on to talking about Anonymous Code's implications for the future of the series and what's to come. When Anonymous Code was first announced, there were a number of concepts and plot points that they had teased that didn't end up being particularly prominent by the time the final version of the game released. One such thing was with regards to the Arecibo message, which we only briefly see in Chapter 11 just before Polon exits the Lode region. To give a little bit of context, in real life, the Arecibo message was a radio message sent from Earth over to the M13 globular cluster, albeit more as a demonstrative act rather than a proper attempt at potential communication with alien species. When represented visually, the message would unveil the numbers 1 through 10, information on the chemical and biochemical composition of human beings, our place in our solar system, and a graphic of the Arecibo telescope. And in Anonymous Code, what we end up seeing of the Arecibo message is a fair bit different from how it actually looked in real life. The in-series Arecibo message is extended, being in 3 different columns, with the middle column being identical to the real-life Arecibo message, and the ones to the left and the right being completely new and presumably working as a pair. But it begs the question of which direction you read the whole mural in. Do you read it from left to right, from right to left, in some kind of zigzag fashion? Whatever the case may be, decoding and deciphering the in-series Arecibo message has been a great challenge for the entire fandom. You can effectively consider it to be akin to one final riddle for the game's players. Within Anonymous Code's Arecibo message, we see quite a few different recognizable symbols. For instance, in the left column, from top to bottom, we see what looks like a satellite, perhaps the SA-4D, planet Earth, the vortex math circle, something in red that spews out yellow stuff, perhaps radio waves, a human who's shorter than the ones in the other 2 columns, some unrecognizable interconnected structure with 7 squares of 4, some odd sequence of yellow squares that doesn't seem to represent the solar system, and then what looks like some trees in the place of the Arecibo telescope. As for the right column, we see a representation of Koch's galaxy in its top left corner. To its right, we also see an eye, that of an observer most likely. Underneath Koch's galaxy is the Earth, and to the Earth's right is something that looks like 2 little people and then some structure. Possibly the Black Knight, if it wasn't that mysterious red thing in the left column. Beneath all of those is a sequence of stacks of green squares, and to their right is an arrangement of 2 lines of squares, a couple of loose squares above those 2 lines, and an infinity symbol beneath those 2 lines. My suspicion is that this part of the mural is representative of world layers and world lines, especially given the juxtaposition of the infinity symbol right by these sequences. Going further down, we have a spiral, likely representative of the Milky Way. Beneath the Milky Way is another person, shorter than the one in the middle, but taller than the one on the left. Below the person, it looks like 3 mini people sandwiched between 2 pyramids. And finally, at the bottom, we have the Arecibo telescope, though it looks completely distorted from how it normally is, like we see in the middle column. But what does all this mean? Some suspect that it hints at the true nature of the Committee of 300 and depicts their ultimate goal. After all, while factions underneath the Committee of 300 are mentioned repeatedly throughout Anonymous Code, very interestingly and intentionally, the actual Committee of 300 is only mentioned in name once throughout the entirety of the game. Some also suspect that the Arecibo message is representative of something concerning the topmost world layer, perhaps suggesting that it's ruled by aliens, especially given the context of the real-life Arecibo message and the in-series Black Knight. Perhaps it depicts the story of the very first, topmost Earth simulator. As for what it truly means, we can only wait and see, I guess, and theorize in the meanwhile. Though funnily enough, one could perhaps interpret us players as the true aliens here, given that we're the ones trying to decode the Arecibo message. In addition to this riddle, Anonymous Code's post-credits scene shows the vortex coil right next to what looks like bits of a supercomputer, most likely the Gaia QCDC, possibly on topside. But as for what it means and what that suggests about the series' future, I don't know, but I do imagine that this post-credits scene will have some bearing on future series plot points past Anonymous Code. Speaking of the series past Anonymous Code, there are quite a number of unreleased but announced SciADV projects in the works at the moment. One of these is of course Steins Gate Reboot. I already talked about this earlier on in the video, but this is of course potentially the post-Gaia reboot version of Steins Gate's events. Many of us suspect that the reboot part of the title has a double meaning. After all, the ending of Anonymous Code reboots Gaia and thus also soft reboots the series. And a post-collapse version of Steins Gate's events could address a good number of series mysteries. Moreover, the One World event began with a transition from the Anonymous Code load trigger to Polon driving his Graper to a low-res monochrome world to the One World logo, also in monochrome. Such would possibly suggest some sort of connection between Anonymous Code and Steins Gate Reboot, which was the One World event's big announcement. But of course, there's always the possibility that mages, being insolvent as they are, makes this a super low-effort cash grab set in the original continuity, which would be disappointing to everyone. Besides Steins Gate Reboot, there is of course Steins something, which as of a few months ago was only in its concepts phase. Just like with Steins Gate Reboot, the big question with Steins something is when it occurs, whether before the worldline collapse or after the worldline collapse. If it takes place before the worldline collapse, then its events will just get undone not too long down the line anyways. And it'll also just end up being another filler entry for the series, which would be extremely disappointing after getting the most plot-driven entry to date and waiting years for it. The only upside I can think of to Reboot and Steins something taking place before the worldline collapse is in the situation that they choose to go in a completely new and original direction in the post-collapse continuity, where there simply isn't a version of Steins Gate or any other currently existing SciADV mainline that ever happens. But I think Mages doing this is unlikely. As for chronological placement, I think the most likely years for Steins something to take place in are 2025 or 2026, with how significant they are for the overarching series canon. If it does take place in 2026, that gives them the opportunity to potentially explore the Anti-Fate faction battle, or whatever the equivalent significant events might be after the worldline collapse if it does take place post-Anonymous Code. Of course, with it still being in its general concepts phase, I don't see it releasing any sooner than late 2026 to begin with, but I am curious to see what they do with Steins something. Beyond the two aforementioned projects, there's also the Hollywood live-action adaptation. Besides the two stage plays if you count them, there's never been any SciADV live-action adaptation to date. And with the concept of world layers, you really wonder how the Hollywood live-action adaptation is going to fit into the overarching canon. Intuitively, it would seemingly have to be on one of the topmost world layers, at the very least on a world layer much higher up than anything we've ever seen before. But if the Hollywood live-action adaptation can fit into the series canon, then could we even consider the stage plays canon too? Good food for thought, I guess. Moving past the Steins sub-series projects and into Occultic 9, we're still waiting on Volume 4 and Occultic 9 Elite, I guess. If the series ever does continue, will they ever address what's up with Ridika? Will they outright confirm some sort of connection between her and Juno? We'll have to see. But that just about wraps up all the implications I wanted to go over in the span of this video. This video is, of course, not completely exhaustive, as there really isn't a single part of the SciADV franchise that Anonymous Code doesn't change our understanding of in some way. With world layers, some would argue that you could even consider things like the mobile gacha game collabs canon, but that's too much of a rabbit hole to get into. Nonetheless, I truly hope that you found this video useful in better understanding the implications that Anonymous Code has on the series. In the comments section, let me know your thoughts on the game's implications for the overarching series, or if you have any questions on the content covered in this video. I'd also like to give a huge shout out to the entire SciADV community, and especially all the admins and regulars on Beyond the Gate and Occultic Code for all the theory crafting and discussions we've had since the Japanese release of Anonymous Code. And I'd like to especially thank the likes of Steiner, It's Riggs, Fasti, Enorvan, Leah, Christy Link, and all the other Japanese speakers in the English SciADV community for their earliest discussions surrounding the game's implications. The community's understanding, and by extension, also my own personal understanding of Anonymous Code's implications, have been heavily shaped by these discussions. I would also like to thank everybody involved in the creation of this video. Special thank you to Fasti, Enorvan, Leah, and Maxi for their help in the brainstorming, outline, and proofreading phases. This video would not be possible if not for their help. Just the script writing alone took an enormous amount of time given the sheer amount of material that I had to go through and double check beforehand. I first started writing up my script for this video shortly after I uploaded my very first video on this channel, which was in December of 2023. But after writing up a few pages of the script, I ultimately ended up getting overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the video. And more than that, I was worried that maybe Steins something would release sooner than I could finish it, thus rendering anything I make completely wrong and a waste of time. I instead shifted gears and started focusing on the Steins Gate movie, which dealt with Anonymous Code's implications, but was much smaller and more manageable in scope. From then onwards, I had a couple of other projects I wanted to get moving, such as my beginner's guide and SciADV anniversary videos. But after all my time with this video on the back burner, I'm glad I've finally been able to get it out. Once again, thank you for watching. Have an awesome day, everyone.